The rain fell in a steady, mournful drizzle the day my daughter-in-law Susan leaned close and whispered, "You'll die alone." Her breath grazed my ear, warm and sharp, her voice so low it was meant for me alone. I stood in her kitchen clutching a tray of oatmeal raisin cookies I'd baked for my grandchildren, the ones I'd offered to watch, so she and my son Michael could steal a rare evening out. Her words struck like a shard of glass, piercing the fragile hope I'd been nursing that I still belonged in their lives, that I wasn't just a ghost lingering in their home. I was 64. My hands trembling under the tray's weight, my heart crumbling under the weight of her cruelty. I didn't let the tears come, not then. I set the tray on the table, forced a smile for my grandbabies, and said, "Eat up, my loves." But inside, I was coming apart. My name is Dorothy Elaine Harper, and I've lived long enough to learn that love can wound deeper than hate. I grew up in a small Ohio town in a weathered, clapboard house with a creaking porch and a mother who taught me to knead bread and whisper prayers with the same quiet devotion. At 19, I married Thomas, my high school sweetheart, and we carved out a life together, simple but woven with meaning. We raised 3 children, 2 boys, Michael and James, and a girl, Lisa, in a home filled with laughter, spilled juice, and the hum of everyday chaos. Thomas worked long hours at the lumber mill, and I tended the house-baked pies for church suppers and sewed curtains from scraps of fabric. When Thomas died 8 years ago, taken by a heart attack in the stillness of night, I thought I'd tasted the worst pain life could offer. I was mistaken. Michael, my youngest, was always my tender one. As a boy, he'd crawl into my lap even when his lanky legs dangled to the floor, begging for one more bedtime story. When he married Susan a decade ago, my heart swelled. She was vibrant, driven with a laugh that could light up a room. I welcomed her like a daughter, sharing my recipes, rocking her newborns, and rearranging my days to help when she launched her real estate business. I believed we were family bound by more than blood. But over time, a chill crept in. Susan's smiles grew thin, her invitations rare. Michael's calls dwindled, replaced by texts, asking for favors alone to cover a bill a weekend, watching the kids, a corner of my garage for their old furniture. I told myself it was just the busyness of young families that love stretched thin, but didn't break. Deep down, though, I felt myself fading from their world. That rainy afternoon in their Columbus kitchen, Susan's words weren't the first hurt, but they cut the deepest. I'd driven an hour from my quiet town, my old Buick rattling along the highway just to see my grandchildren, Emma and Lucas. I'd packed cookies, a puzzle for Emma, and a bright red toy truck for Lucas. I'd offered to babysit, thinking I was easing Susan's load. I thought I was needed, but when I said it, Susan's face tightened. She glanced at Michael, who was lost in his phone, oblivious as ever, and then she leaned in. "You'll die alone," she hissed, her voice laced with venom. "Nobody wants you here, Dorothy. Stop trying so hard." The words echoed in my skull, each one a hammer against my heart. I don't know how I made it through the rest of the visit. I sat on the floor with Emma and Lucas, their giggles a fragile anchor. But every glance at Susan burned. Her eyes held the truth of her words, cold and unyielding. Michael didn't see it. He never did. When I left, I knelt to hug the kids, pressing kisses to their soft foreheads, and walked to my car through the rain. I drove home in silence, the windshield wipers swiping at the downpour, my tears blurring everything else. Susan's voice looped in my mind, relentless. Was she right? Had I become a burden, an old woman clinging to a family that had outgrown her? My house, the small 2-bedroom I'd shared with Thomas, felt like a tomb that night. The walls were a gallery of memories: Michael's high school graduation, Lisa's wedding, James as a boy grinning with a fishing pole. I sank into the armchair where Thomas used to read its fabric worn soft by years and stared at those photos until my eyes ached. I'd given my life to my family, I'd stayed up sewing Halloween costumes, driven hours to cheer at soccer games, skipped new dresses to save for their college funds. I'd buried my own dreams to lift theirs. And now at 64, I sat alone, my worth, measured by how little I seemed to matter to the people I loved most. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness that clung like damp wool. I brewed coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop more out of habit than purpose. Susan had posted on social media photos of Emma and Lucas at the park. Michael tossing a football, her own face radiant. Not a trace of me, not a hint I'd been there hours before. I scrolled through her page, my throat tightening with each post. There were family dinners. I hadn't been invited to a birthday party for Lucas I'd only heard about from Lisa. I was being erased one memory at a time, like a photo left too long in the sun. And then I saw it, a post that stopped my breath. A picture of a house, a grand Victorian with gables and stained glass windows set in a neighborhood of manicured lawns. Our dream home, Susan had written. Fingers crossed, we win the bid. I stared at that house, my coffee forgotten, the mug cold in my hands. The Victorian was breathtaking, the kind of place Susan had always talked about, with wrap-around porches and rooms for her big plans. I could almost hear her voice, bright and commanding, telling Michael it was perfect for their future, a future that didn't include me. Something stirred in my chest, not anger, not yet, but a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't defiance, but it was close. Resolve, maybe. I'd spent decades building a life pinching pennies, tucking away a small inheritance from my mother in a savings account no one knew about. I wasn't the frail, useless woman Susan saw. I wasn't as powerless as they believed. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, watching the rain pool in the flower beds Thomas had built. Susan's words still stung, but they were starting to feel less like a verdict and more like a challenge. I didn't know what I'd do, not yet, but I knew I couldn't let her define me. I'd survived loss before Thomas's death, the slow drift of my children, the shrinking of my world. I could survive this, and maybe, just maybe, I could do more than survive. Maybe I could remind them who I was. Not the grandmother they pitied, not the mother they overlooked, but Dorothy Elaine Harper, a woman who had always found a way to rise. The days after Susan's words felt like wading through fog. I woke each morning to the same quiet house, the same ache in my chest, her whisper echoing like a ghost that wouldn't leave. You'll die alone. I tried to shake it off, to fill the hours with the small rituals that had always grounded me, watering the geraniums, baking bread, dusting the picture frames that held my family's faces. But the silence was louder now, heavier, as if the walls themselves were mourning the life I'd lost. I was 64, and the world I'd built seemed to be slipping through my fingers, leaving me with nothing but memories and a heart too stubborn to break completely. I stopped calling Michael, not out of spite, but because I couldn't bear the sound of his distracted voice, the way he'd rush me off the phone with promises to visit that never came. I didn't text Susan either, though I checked her social media more than I'd admit, each post a fresh wound. Photos of Emma and Lucas at a pumpkin patch, Susan's caption gushing about family time. No mention of me. No trace of the grandmother who'd taught Emma to braid daisies or sung Lucas to sleep. I was being written out of their story, and the worst part was how easy it seemed for them. I'd always thought love was a tether, something that held even when it stretched. But now I wondered if I'd been wrong, if love could simply dissolve, leaving one side grasping at air. The loneliness was a physical thing, a weight that pressed against my ribs. I'd never been one for self-pity. My mother raised me to keep my chin up, to find joy in small things. But this was different. This was abandonment, not just by Susan, but by Michael, who let her words stand unchallenged, and by the family I'd poured my soul into. I stopped going to church suppers, too tired to face the sympathetic smiles of women who'd ask after my kids. I avoided the grocery store where I might run into old neighbors, their questions about Michael's job or Susan's business too painful to answer. I shrank into my house, into myself, wondering if this was what Susan meant, if this was how I'd die alone with my regrets. But even in that darkness, there were moments that flickered like candles. One morning, about a week after the kitchen incident, I found myself at the community center. I'd gone to drop off a box of Thomas's old clothes for the charity drive, something I'd been putting off for years. The place was buzzing with volunteers, most of them my age or older, sorting donations and laughing over coffee. I was about to leave when a woman named Ruth called my name. She was 70, with silver hair and eyes that sparkled like she knew a secret. We'd known each other vaguely from church, but she'd always been a whirlwind organizing fundraisers and book clubs, while I stayed on the sidelines. "Dorothy Harper, you're not sneaking out already," she said, her voice warm but firm. She was holding a stack of sweaters, her glasses perched on her nose. "Come help me sort these. We're drowning in donations, and I could use a friend." I hesitated. I wasn't in the mood for company, and the idea of small talk felt exhausting. But Ruth's smile was so genuine, her invitation so unforced, that I couldn't say no. I spent the next 2 hours folding clothes beside her, listening to her stories about her late husband, her grown daughters, and the pottery class she'd started on a whim. She didn't pry, didn't ask why I looked like I hadn't slept in days. Instead, she handed me a cup of coffee and said, "You've got a good heart, Dorothy. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Her words stayed with me small but steady like a pebble in my pocket. I went back to the community center the next day and the day after that. I didn't talk much, but I listened, and I worked sorting books, packing food boxes, wrapping gifts for the children's holiday drive. Ruth was always there, her laughter a balm, her presence a reminder that I wasn't invisible to everyone. One afternoon as we taped up boxes, she nudged my shoulder and said, "You're quieter than usual, Dorothy. Want to tell me what's weighing you down?" I almost didn't. The shame of Susan's words, of Michael's silence, was too raw. But Ruth's eyes were kind, and the weight of carrying it alone was crushing me. So I told her haltingly at first, then in a rush about the kitchen, the whisper, the way my own son had let it happen. I told her about the social media posts, the family events I wasn't invited to, the dream house Susan was chasing. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking, and Ruth was holding them, her grip warm and steady. "Dorothy." She said, her voice low but fierce, "You are not alone and you are not worthless. That girl doesn't get to decide who you are. You've got more strength in you than she'll ever understand." I wanted to believe her, but the hurt was still too fresh. Still, something in her words took root, a tiny seed of defiance. I started noticing things about myself. I'd forgotten how my hands, though wrinkled, could still knead dough with precision, how my voice could still soothe a crying child at the center. I wasn't useless. I wasn't done. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to accept the role Susan had cast me in. One evening, after a long day at the center, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and opened my laptop again. I wasn't looking for Susan's posts this time. Instead, I searched for the house, the Victorian she'd called her dream. The listing was still up, the price staggering but not impossible. I stared at the photos, the wraparound porch, the stained glass windows catching the light. Susan wanted it to prove something, to build a life that didn't include me. But as I looked at it, I felt a pull not for the house itself, but for what it represented. A chance to take something back, to stand taller than the woman they thought I was. I'd always been frugal, saving every spare dollar in a bank account no one knew about. It started when Thomas and I were young, tucking away bits of his paycheck for emergencies. After he died, I added a small inheritance from my mother, letting it grow quietly over the years. My children never asked about money. They assumed I had just enough to get by, and I let them. But the truth was, I'd saved more than they could imagine, a fortune built from sacrifice and patience. As I sat there staring at the house, an idea began to form. Not a plan, not yet, but a possibility. What if I didn't just fade away? What if I showed them, who I really was. The next day I called my bank. The woman on the phone was polite, confirming my balance, asking if I wanted to transfer funds or open a new account. I didn't tell her why I was checking, didn't say I was thinking about a house that could change everything. But as I hung up, I felt a shift inside me like a door creaking open. I wasn't ready to walk through it, not yet, but I could see the light on the other side. I went back to the community center, helped Ruth pack more boxes, and when she asked how I was doing, I smiled, not the forced smile I'd worn for weeks, but something real. "I'm still here," I said, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it. The weeks that followed felt like a slow thawing, as if the ice around my heart was beginning to crack, letting slivers of light slip through. Susan's words, "You'll die alone," still haunted me, waking me in the small hours when the house was too quiet, but they weren't the only voice in my head anymore. Ruth's words, her fierce insistence that I was more than the pain I carried, echoed too, and they were louder, steadier. I was 64. And though I'd been cast aside by the family I'd built my life around, I was starting to see that I didn't have to stay in the shadows they'd pushed me into. I could choose to step out even if the steps were small, even if they trembled. I kept going to the community center, drawn by Ruth's warmth and the rhythm of purpose I found there. The work was simple, sorting clothes, packing food boxes, wrapping toys for the Christmas drive, but it anchored me. I'd spent so long feeling like a guest in my own family, tolerated but not wanted, that being useful again, even in this small way, was like remembering how to breathe. The other volunteers, most of them women my age, didn't treat me like a burden. They teased me when I folded sweaters, too neatly shared recipes over coffee, and asked my opinion on everything from paint colors to parenting advice. For the first time in months, I felt seen, not as Michael's mother or Susan's inconvenience, but as Dorothy, a woman with a voice and a place. Ruth became my lifeline. She had a way of pulling me out of my head, her laughter cutting through the fog of my thoughts. One afternoon, as we sorted canned goods for the food pantry, she caught me staring into space, a can of peaches forgotten in my hand. "Dorothy," she said, nudging me with her elbow. "You're a million miles away. What's got you so quiet?" I hesitated. I told her about Susan's cruelty, about Michael's silence, but I hadn't shared the rest. The house, the savings, the spark of an idea that was growing inside me. It felt too big, too reckless to say out loud. But Ruth had a way of listening that made secrets feel safe, so I set the can down and told her. I told her about Susan's dream house, the Victorian with its gables and stained glass windows, and how it had become a symbol of everything I wasn't invited to be part of. I told her about my savings, the account I'd kept hidden for decades, built from years of scrimping and a modest inheritance from my mother. And I told her about the thought that wouldn't leave me: what if I bought the house? What if I took something they wanted, not out of spite, but to prove I was still here, still whole? Ruth didn't laugh or tell me I was crazy. She leaned back, her eyes narrowing like she was sizing up a puzzle. "Dorothy Elaine Harper." She said, her voice slow and deliberate. "You've got more fire in you than you let on. If you want that house, you go for it. Not to hurt them, but to remind yourself who you are. You're not some old lady they get to push around. You're a force." Her words lit something in me, a warmth that spread through my chest. I wasn't ready to act, not yet, but the idea was taking shape, growing roots. I started paying closer attention to the house listing, checking it daily on my laptop. The price was steep, but my savings were enough, more than enough. I'd never told my children about the money, not because I didn't trust them, but because it was mine, a piece of security I'd built for myself. Thomas and I had always been careful saving for rainy days, and after he died, I'd kept it up, adding to the account bit by bit. It was a fortune by my standards, though I'd never dreamed of spending it on something like this. But now, the thought of using it felt less like a whim and more like a reclamation. I didn't tell anyone else, not even Ruth, about the next step I took. One morning, after a sleepless night, I called a real estate agent, a woman named Claire, who'd been recommended by a volunteer at the center. I told her I was interested in a property, keeping my voice steady as if I did this sort of thing all the time. Claire was kind but professional, asking about my budget and preferences. I gave her the address of the Victorian, and when she didn't blink at the price, I felt a surge of confidence. We arranged to visit the house the following week, and as I hung up, I realized my hands weren't shaking. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward, not just drifting through the wreckage of my life. The visit to the house was a revelation. It was even more beautiful than the photos, with wide oak floors, a staircase that curved like a promise, and windows that spilled light in every color. Standing in the living room, I could almost hear the echoes of a life I'd once imagined: family dinners, grandchildren running through the halls, Thomas's laughter. But I also saw something else, a life that was mine alone, filled with my own choices, my own joy. Claire walked me through the rooms, pointing out details, the crown molding the built-in bookshelves, but I was only half listening. I was thinking about Susan, about how she saw this house as her future, a future that excluded me. And I was thinking about myself, about the woman I'd been before grief and neglect had worn me down. I didn't make an offer that day, but I asked Claire to keep me updated on the bidding. She nodded, sensing I wasn't just browsing, and promised to call if anything changed. As I drove home, the rain had stopped, and the sky was a fragile blue, like the first breath after a storm. I felt different, not fearless, but less afraid. I was starting to see that I didn't have to accept the loneliness Susan had predicted. I could build something new, even if it was just for me. Back at the community center, I threw myself into the work with a new energy. Ruth noticed teasing me about the spring in my step. I didn't tell her about the house visit, but I let her drag me to a pottery class one evening where I shaped a lopsided bowl and laughed harder than I had in years. I started baking again, not just for myself, but for the volunteers bringing trays of cookies and pies that earned me hugs and compliments. I even joined a book club. Ruth ran, though I mostly listened, letting the stories of other women's lives remind me that I wasn't the only one who'd faced loss and found a way through. One night, as I sat in my armchair with a cup of chamomile tea, I opened my laptop and checked Susan's social media. There was a new post about the house, a photo of her and Michael standing in front of it, her caption full of excitement. So close to making our dream a reality. My stomach twisted, but not with the same despair I'd felt before. Instead, I felt a quiet resolve. I wasn't going to let Susan's dream erase me. I wasn't going to let her words define my future. I closed the laptop and walked to the mirror in my hallway, the one Thomas had hung when we first moved in. I looked at myself, gray hairlines around my eyes, a face that had seen too much sorrow, and I saw something else: strength. Not the loud, flashy kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that endures. The next morning, I called Claire and told her I wanted to bid on the house. I didn't know if I'd win, didn't know if I was ready for what it would mean, but I knew I was ready to try to take a stand for the woman I was becoming. As I hung up, I felt a weight lift, not all of it, but enough to let me breathe. I wasn't alone, not entirely. I had Ruth, the community center, the memory of Thomas's love. And I had myself, Dorothy Elaine Harper, a woman who was far from finished. The decision to bid on the house felt like a door swinging open, letting in a draft of possibility I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the Victorian with its gables and stained glass windows. It was about claiming something for myself, something Susan and Michael couldn't take away. At 64, I was tired of being the woman who faded into the background, the grandmother they tolerated, the mother they forgot. Susan's words, "You'll die alone," still stung, but they were losing their power, drowned out by the quiet rhythm of my own resolve. I was starting to remember who I was, and that memory was a fire, small but growing. I didn't tell anyone about the bid, not even Ruth. It felt too fragile, too personal, like a prayer you whisper only to yourself. Claire, my real estate agent, was brisk and efficient, guiding me through the process with a calm that steadied my nerves. She told me the house was in high demand with multiple offers, including one from a young couple with a strong bid. I knew without her saying it that the couple was Susan and Michael. My heart twisted at the thought, not with anger, but with a strange mix of sadness and determination. They were building a future that didn't include me, and I was building one that didn't depend on them. I told Claire to offer above the asking price, using a portion of my savings I'd never touched. She didn't ask why, but her voice softened when she said, "I'll make sure your bid is strong, Dorothy." While I waited for news, I threw myself into life at the community center. The work there had become a lifeline, a place where I wasn't defined by Susan's cruelty or Michael's indifference. I helped organize a spring fundraiser, baking pies and arranging tables with Ruth and the other volunteers. I started speaking up more, offering ideas for the event, and when Ruth praised my knack for details, I felt a flicker of pride. It had been so long since anyone noticed what I could do, not just what I could give. One afternoon, as we strung fairy lights across the community center's patio, Ruth grabbed my hand and twirled me like we were girls at a dance. I laughed, breathless, and for a moment I wasn't the grieving widow or the discarded mother. I was Dorothy, alive and whole. At home, I began to reclaim my space. The house Thomas and I had shared was full of memories, but it had also become a shrine to my losses: his armchair, his tools in the garage, the photos of a family that no longer gathered. I didn't want to erase him, but I needed room to breathe. I started small, rearranging the living room, moving the armchair to a corner, and adding a new throw blanket in a soft blue that made me smile. I cleared out the guest room, boxing up old toys and clothes my grandchildren had outgrown, and turned it into a reading nook with a lamp and a shelf for the books I'd started borrowing from Ruth's book club. Each change felt like a declaration, a way of saying I was still here, still building a life. One evening, I found a box in the attic tucked behind Christmas decorations. It was full of letters Thomas had written me when we were young, before we married, when he was working summers at a logging camp. I sat on the floor, dust on my knees, and read them one by one. His words were simple but full of love, promising a life we'd build together no matter how hard it got. "You're my home dot," he'd written in his slanted scrawl. "Always will be." I cried then, not just for him, but for the woman I'd been strong, hopeful, unafraid. I wanted to be her again, not for anyone else, but for me. The next morning, I took one of Thomas's old watches, a battered silver thing he'd worn every day, and put it on my wrist. It was too big sliding against my skin, but it felt right, like carrying a piece of his strength with me. I wore it to the community center, and when Ruth noticed, she didn't ask questions, just squeezed my hand. I was starting to see that strength wasn't about shouting or fighting. It was about the quiet choices, the ones no one else saw. Like bidding on a house. Like wearing a watch that reminded me I'd survived loss before. Claire called a week later, her voice bright with news. My bid had been accepted. The house was mine. I sat at my kitchen table, the phone still in my hand, and let the words sink in. I owned the Victorian, the one Susan had called her dream, the one she'd planned to fill with a life that excluded me. I didn't feel triumph, not exactly, but I felt power. Not the kind that hurts, but the kind that heals. I'd done this alone with my own money, my own will. For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. I didn't tell Susan or Michael. I didn't tell anyone. Instead, I drove to the house the next day just to see it again. Claire met me there, handing me the keys with a smile. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The light poured through the stained glass windows, painting the walls in shades of amber and blue. I could imagine Susan here, her laughter, her plans, but I could also imagine myself reading in the sunroom, planting roses in the garden, inviting Ruth and the volunteers for coffee. This house wasn't just a victory, it was a beginning. Over the next few weeks, I started making plans. I hired a contractor to fix the creaky porch, chose paint colors for the walls, and bought a few pieces of furniture, a table for the dining room, a soft armchair for the living room. I didn't move in, not yet. I wasn't ready to leave the house I'd shared with Thomas, and part of me wanted to keep this new life separate, a secret I could hold close. But I visited often each trip, a reminder that I was more than the woman Susan had tried to erase. At the community center, I grew bolder. I volunteered to lead a baking workshop, teaching a group of women how to make my mother's cinnamon rolls. Their laughter and questions filled me up, and when one of them hugged me, saying she'd never tasted anything so good, I felt tears prick my eyes. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. I started wearing brighter colors, trading my gray cardigans for scarves in red and turquoise. I even let Ruth talk me into a haircut, a short bob that made me feel lighter, younger, though I laughed when she called me a silver fox. One night, as I sat in my reading nook with Thomas's watch ticking on my wrist, I thought about Susan and Michael. I hadn't heard from them since the kitchen incident, and I hadn't reached out. Part of me still ached for my son, for the boy who'd once clung to me, but I was starting to accept that he'd made his choices. I couldn't change him, but I could change myself. I opened my laptop and looked at the house listing again, now marked as sold. Susan had posted about it her words, bitter. Lost our dream house. Some things aren't meant to be. I closed the laptop, my heart steady. She didn't know it was me, not yet, but she would. And when she did, it wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about truth, my worth, my life. I went to bed that night with Thomas's letters on my nightstand, his watch on my wrist, and a quiet certainty in my chest. I wasn't alone, not in the way Susan meant. I had Ruth, the community center, the house that was mine. And most of all, I had myself, Dorothy Elaine Harper, a woman who was learning to rise again, one choice at a time. The Victorian house became my sanctuary, a place where I could be the woman I was rediscovering, not the one Susan and Michael had tried to diminish. Each time I stepped through its heavy oak door, the scent of fresh paint and polished wood greeted me, and the light through the stained glass windows felt like a promise. I was 64, and though Susan's words, "You'll die alone," still lingered in the quiet moments, they no longer held me captive. I was building something new, not just a home, but a life that was mine, shaped by my hands, my choices, my heart. The house was more than a purchase. It was a declaration that I was still here, still worthy, still capable of dreaming. I hadn't moved in yet. My old house, the one I'd shared with Thomas, still held too many memories. His laughter, our children's footsteps, the life we'd woven together. But I visited the Victorian often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Claire, who helped me navigate the details of ownership. I chose curtains in soft ivory, hung a mirror in the foyer, and planted lavender along the front path, its scent rising with every breeze. Each decision, no matter how small, felt like a step toward reclaiming myself. I wasn't erasing the past. I was making room for the present, for the woman I was becoming. At the community center, my confidence grew. Ruth noticed it teasing me about the way I carried myself, my shoulders straighter, my smile quicker. I'd started leading more activities, baking workshops, a knitting circle, even a storytelling night where I shared memories of my childhood in Ohio, the clapboard house, and my mother's lessons about resilience. The other volunteers listened, their eyes bright, and when they clapped, I felt a warmth I hadn't known I'd been missing. I wasn't just Dorothy, the grandmother pushed aside by her family. I was Dorothy, the woman who could still make people laugh, who could still teach, who could still matter. One afternoon while we were setting up for a fundraiser, Ruth pulled me aside. "You're different, Dorothy," she said, her eyes searching mine. "Not just happier, but stronger. What's going on? And don't tell me it's just my imagination." I smiled, my fingers brushing Thomas's watch on my wrist. I hadn't told her about the house, not yet. It wasn't that I didn't trust her. It was that the secret felt sacred, a piece of myself I wasn't ready to share. But Ruth had a way of seeing through me, so I gave her a half-truth. I'm just finding my feet again, I said, trying to remember who I am without all the noise. She nodded, but her eyes said she knew there was more. Well, whoever you're becoming, she's a force. Don't forget that. Her words stayed with me, and they pushed me to take bolder steps. I started meeting with a financial advisor, a quiet man named Paul, who helped me understand my savings and how to manage the wealth I'd kept hidden for so long. I'd always thought of the money as a safety net, something to fall back on, but now I saw it as a tool, a way to shape my future. Paul suggested investments, charitable donations, even a trust for my grandchildren, but I wasn't ready to decide. For now, the house was enough a tangible reminder that I could act, that I could choose. I also began to reconnect with parts of myself I'd buried. I found an old sketchbook in the attic filled with drawings I'd done as a young woman, landscapes, flowers, portraits of Thomas and the kids. I hadn't drawn in decades, but one evening I bought a set of pencils and sat at the Victorians' dining table sketching the view from the sunroom. The lines were shaky at first, but as I worked, I felt a spark of joy, the kind I'd felt as a girl when the world seemed full of possibility. I started sketching regularly, filling pages with the house, the lavender, even Ruth's face, her eyes crinkled with laughter. It wasn't about being good, it was about being alive. One day, while I was at the community center, I got a call from my daughter Lisa. She lived in Chicago, busy with her career and her own family, and we didn't talk often. Her voice was warm but cautious, asking how I was mentioning she'd heard from Michael that I hadn't been around much. I froze, wondering what he'd said if Susan had painted me as the problem. But Lisa didn't push. Instead, she invited me to visit, saying she missed me that her kids were asking for their grandma. I wanted to believe her, but the hurt from Michael and Susan made me wary. Still, I promised to think about it, and when we hung up, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe not all my children had forgotten me. That hope was tested a week later. I was at the Victorian planting roses in the backyard when my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. It was brief, almost formal family barbecue next weekend. You should come. No apology, no mention of the months of silence, no acknowledgement of Susan's cruelty. I stared at the message, my hands still in the dirt, Thomas's watch glinting in the sun. Part of me wanted to go to see Emma and Lucas to pretend things could be normal. But another part, the part that had bid on this house, that had worn Thomas's watch and sketched until midnight, knew better. I didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, I called Claire and asked about the house's progress. The repairs were nearly done, the paint dry, the furniture in place. I told her I wanted to host a small gathering soon, maybe for the community center volunteers to celebrate the house. She agreed to help, and as we talked, an idea formed, not fully clear, but sharp enough to make my pulse quicken. What if I invited Michael and Susan to the house, not to confront them, but to show them what I'd done, who I was? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, but it felt right, like the next step in a journey I hadn't planned, but was walking anyway. I spent the next few days preparing not just the house, but myself. I bought a new dress, a deep green that Ruth said brought out my eyes. I hung my sketches on the Victorians' walls, their simple lines a quiet testament to my growth. I even burned a letter I'd written to Susan after the kitchen incident, one I'd never sent, full of hurt and questions. I watched the paper curl in the fireplace, the smoke carrying my anger away. I didn't need to ask why she'd hurt me. I didn't need her approval. I had my own. The night before the barbecue, I sat in the Victorian sunroom, Thomas's watch heavy on my wrist, and thought about what was coming. I wasn't sure how it would unfold, but I knew I was ready not for revenge, but for truth. I wanted Susan to see the house, to know I'd bought it, to understand that I wasn't the woman she'd dismissed. I wanted Michael to see me, really see me, not as a convenience or a burden, but as his mother, a woman with her own strength. And most of all, I wanted to stand in that moment not as a victim, but as Dorothy Elaine Harper, whole and unbroken. I went to bed that night with a calm I hadn't felt in years. The house was ready, its rooms glowing with the life I'd poured into them. My heart was ready too, not free of scars, but stronger for them. I didn't know what the barbecue would bring, but I knew I wouldn't face it alone. I had Ruth, my sketches, the community center, the memory of Thomas's love, and I had myself, a woman who had lost so much, but was finding her way back one quiet, powerful choice at a time. The morning of the family barbecue dawned bright, the kind of clear June day that makes you believe in new beginnings. I woke early in my old house, the one I'd shared with Thomas, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Thomas's watch ticking softly on my wrist. The invitation from Michael still sat unanswered on my phone, its curt words, "Family barbecue next weekend. You should come," stirring a mix of longing and resolve. I wanted to see my grandchildren Emma and Lucas, to hear their laughter and feel their small arms around me. But I also knew that stepping back into their world, Susan's world, meant facing the woman who'd whispered, "I die alone." At 64, I was no longer willing to shrink myself to fit their expectations. I was ready to show them who I was, and the Victorian house, my house, was the stage. I spent the morning preparing not just for the barbecue, but for what I'd planned afterward. I packed a small bag with a change of clothes, my sketchbook, and a photo of Thomas and me from our wedding day, his arm around my waist, both of us grinning, like the world was ours. I slipped it into my purse, a talisman of the love that had shaped me. Then I drove to the Victorian, the keys jingling in my hand as I unlocked the door. The house was ready, its rooms polished and warm, the lavender along the path, scenting the air. I walked through each space, touching the curtains I'd chosen, the table I'd set for the gathering I'd host later. This wasn't just a house, it was a testament to my strength, a life I'd built from the ashes of neglect. I called Ruth, needing her steadiness to anchor me. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright. "Dorothy, you sound like you're up to something. Spill it." I laughed, the sound surprising me. "I'm going to Michael's barbecue today," I said. "But afterward I want to show them the house, Susan, Michael, the kids. I want them to see what I've done." There was a pause, and I could almost see Ruth's eyes narrowing, her mind turning. "You bought it, didn't you?" She said not a question, but a statement. That dream house Susan was crowing about. "It's yours." I hadn't told her, but Ruth had always seen through me. Yes, I admitted, my voice steady, "and I'm ready for them to know." She let out a whoop that made me pull the phone from my ear. "Dorothy Elaine Harper, you are a marvel. You go show them what you're made of, and if you need backup, you know where to find me." Her words carried me through the drive to Michael's house in Columbus. The barbecue was in their backyard, a sprawling space with a grill, picnic tables, and balloons tied to chairs for Lucas's upcoming birthday. I parked my Buick and sat for a moment, smoothing my green dress, the one Ruth said brought out my eyes. I felt Thomas's watch against my skin, a reminder of the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. Then I stepped out a tray of my oatmeal raisin cookies in hand and walked toward the noise. Emma saw me first, her face lighting up as she ran across the grass. "Grandma!" She squealed, throwing her arms around my legs. Lucas followed, tugging at my hand, his toy truck clutched tight. Their joy was a balm, soothing the ache of the months I'd been kept at arm's length. I knelt to hug them, breathing in their warmth, and for a moment nothing else mattered. But then I saw Susan standing by the grill with a glass of wine, her smile tight as she watched me. Michael was next to her, flipping burgers, his eyes flicking to me briefly before looking away. No warmth, no welcome, just the same indifference that had cut me so deeply. I set the cookies on a table, exchanging small talk with neighbors and cousins I hadn't seen in months. They asked about my health, my house, but their questions felt like pity, and I answered with polite deflections. Susan didn't approach me, but I felt her eyes sharp and assessing, as if measuring how much space I dared to take. I played with Emma and Lucas, pushing them on the swings, listening to their chatter about school and superheroes. But the whole time I was aware of the plan forming in my mind, the invitation I'd extend before I left. As the afternoon waned, I found Michael alone by the cooler refilling ice. I took a breath, steadying myself. "Michael," I said, my voice calm but firm. I'd like you and Susan to come to a house I've been working on. It's not far. Bring the kids. Maybe tomorrow." He looked surprised, his brow furrowing. "A house? What, like a project?" "Something like that," I said, keeping my tone light. "I'd love for you to see it." He nodded, distracted, already turning back to the cooler. "Yeah, sure, Mom. Text me the address." I found Susan next, her laughter loud as she talked with friends. I waited until she was alone, then approached, my heart pounding but my face serene. "Susan," I said, "I'm hosting a small gathering at a house I've bought. Tomorrow afternoon. I'd like you and Michael to come with Emma and Lucas." Her eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering. "You bought a house?" Her voice was skeptical, almost mocking. "Where?" "You'll see," I said, smiling softly. "I think you'll like it." She didn't press, but I saw the calculation in her gaze, the way she was already rewriting the story in her mind. I didn't care. I'd said what I needed to, and as I hugged Emma and Lucas goodbye, I felt a quiet power settling in my bones. I drove back to the Victorian, not to my old house, and spent the evening preparing. I set out chairs in the backyard, arranged flowers on the dining table, and hung another sketch on the wall, a drawing of the rose bushes I'd planted, their blooms bold against the page. The house was ready, and so was I. The next afternoon I waited in the Victorian's foyer, my green dress swapped for a soft cream blouse and slacks, Thomas's watch gleaming on my wrist. Ruth had insisted on coming, not to interfere, but to stand by me, and she sat in the living room sipping tea and winking when I caught her eye. The doorbell rang and my heart leapt, but I opened the door with a calm I'd earned. Michael stood there, Emma and Lucas at his side, Susan behind him, her face a mask of curiosity and something sharper distrust. "Welcome," I said, stepping aside. "Come in." They walked into the foyer, Emma gasping at the stained glass windows, Lucas running to touch the staircase. Susan's eyes darted around, taking in the polished floors, the curtains, the light. I saw the moment recognition hit her, the way her mouth tightened, her hands clenching. Michael looked confused, glancing at Susan, then at me. "Mom," he said, his voice uncertain. You bought this house." "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I did." Susan's face paled, but she said nothing. Her eyes locked on mine. I didn't flinch. I led them through the house, showing them the sunroom, the kitchen, the backyard where the roses bloomed. Emma and Lucas ran ahead delighted, but Susan and Michael trailed behind, their silence heavy. I didn't explain, didn't boast. I let the house speak for me, its beauty a quiet rebuke to the woman who'd thought I was nothing. In the living room, I paused, turning to face them. "I've been saving for years," I said, my words simple but clear. "More than you knew. This is my home now, and I'm proud of it. I wanted you to see it, to understand." Susan's lips parted, but no words came. Michael looked at the floor, his shoulders hunched. Emma tugged at my hand, asking if she could draw in the sunroom, and I smiled, leading her there, leaving Susan and Michael to process. Ruth caught my eye, her nod a silent cheer. I wasn't done, not yet, but I'd taken the first step. I'd shown them who I was not with anger, but with dignity, with truth. And in that moment I felt taller, stronger, more myself than I had in years. The air in the Victorian's living room felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Susan stood rigid, her eyes darting between the polished oak floors and the stained glass windows, her silence louder than any words she might have spoken. Michael shifted beside her, his gaze fixed on the floor as if he could avoid the truth by not meeting my eyes. Emma and Lucas were oblivious, their laughter echoing from the sunroom where they scribbled in my sketchbook, but the tension between us, adults, was palpable, a taut thread ready to snap. I was 64, standing in the home I'd bought with my own strength, and for the first time I wasn't afraid of their judgment. I wasn't the woman Susan had dismissed, the mother Michael had overlooked. I was Dorothy Elaine Harper, and this moment was mine. I let the silence stretch, savoring the weight of it. Susan's face was a study in shock. Her lips pressed tight, her hands clenched at her sides. I could see the calculations racing behind her eyes. How had I done this? How had the grandmother she'd mocked, the one she'd told would die alone, outbid her on the house she'd called her dream? Michael's discomfort was quieter, his shoulders hunched, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. He hadn't known about my savings, hadn't cared enough to ask about my life. And now here we were in a house that was mine, not theirs, a truth they couldn't ignore. Ruth sat in the corner, her teacup poised, her eyes gleaming with pride. She'd stayed quiet as promised, but her presence was a steady anchor reminding me I wasn't alone. I took a breath, my voice calm but clear, and addressed them both. "I wanted you to see this place," I said, gesturing to the room, the light spilling through the windows in hues of amber and blue. Not to boast, but because it's part of who I am now. I've spent years saving, planning, building something for myself. You didn't know that, and maybe I didn't share it. But this is my home, and I'm proud of it. Susan's eyes flashed a spark of something anger, embarrassment, I couldn't tell. "You bought this house," she said, her voice low, almost accusatory. "This house, the one we were bidding on." "Yes," I said, simply holding her gaze. "I did." Her mouth opened, then closed, as if the words she wanted wouldn't come. Michael finally looked up, his face a mix of confusion and something softer, guilt maybe. "Mom," he started, then stopped, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't know you had... why didn't you tell us?" I could have answered with bitterness, could have listed the times I'd tried to be part of their lives, only to be pushed away. I could have reminded him of Susan's whisper, of the months of silence, of the family events I'd learned about through social media. But I didn't. I wasn't here to hurt them, not even Susan, though the pain she'd caused still burned. I was here to stand in my truth, to let them see me as I was not, as they'd chosen to see me. "I didn't tell you because I didn't think you'd care." I said, my voice gentle but firm. "You've been busy with your lives, and I've been finding my own way. This house is part of that. It's not about taking something from you. It's about building something for me." Susan's face reddened, and for a moment I thought she might argue, might lash out as she had in the kitchen that rainy day. But she didn't. She looked around the room at the sketches I'd hung on the walls, the roses visible through the window, the life I'd created without her permission. And she said nothing. Her silence was louder than any apology, heavier than any defense. It was the silence of someone who'd misjudged, who'd underestimated, who'd lost something she couldn't name. Emma ran in, then her hands smudged with pencil, holding up a drawing of a flower. "Grandma, look," she said, her eyes bright. I knelt to admire it, my heart swelling at her joy, and Lucas followed, tugging at my sleeve to show me his own scribbles. Their innocence was a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of the moment's intensity. I hugged them, breathing in their warmth, and stood turning to Michael and Susan. "I'd like you to come back sometime," I said, my voice steady. "For the kids, for family. But things need to change. I'm not just a grandmother you call when you need something. I'm a person with my own life, my own worth. I hope you can respect that." Michael nodded, his eyes still avoiding mine, but I saw the weight of my words settle on him. Susan's face was unreadable. Her arms crossed, but she didn't argue. I didn't need her to. I'd said what I needed to, not with anger, but with dignity, the kind that comes from knowing your own value. I walked them to the door, Emma and Lucas chattering, Michael murmuring a quiet, "Thanks, Mom," Susan trailing behind. As they stepped onto the porch, I felt a shift, not in them, but in me. I'd flipped the dynamic not with a shout, but with a quiet truth. They knew now, and they'd never see me the same way again. After they left, Ruth set her teacup down and clapped her hands, her grin wide. "Dorothy, that was magnificent," she said, pulling me into a hug. "You didn't just show them a house. You showed them you." I laughed, the sound shaky but real, and hugged her back. "I don't know if it'll change anything I said, but it changed me." "It will," she said, her voice certain. "They'll feel it even if they don't admit it. And you're unstoppable now." We spent the rest of the afternoon in the backyard, sipping lemonade and planning a gathering for the community center volunteers. I invited them for the following weekend, wanting to fill the house with laughter with people who saw me for who I was. As the sun set, painting the roses in gold, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I wasn't naive. I knew Susan's pride might keep her distant, that Michael's guilt might not be enough to bridge the gap. But I didn't need their approval anymore. I had my home, my sketches, my friends, my grandchildren's love. I had myself. That night, I sat in the sunroom, Thomas's watch glinting in the lamplight, and wrote a letter not to Susan or Michael, but to myself. I wrote about the woman I'd been, the one who'd given everything to her family, and the woman I was, now the one who'd bought a house and stood tall in its truth. I wrote about the pain, the betrayal, the quiet strength that had carried me through. When I finished, I folded the letter and tucked it into the box with Thomas's letters, a piece of my story to keep. I went to bed in the Victorian. For the first time, the guest room's bed soft under my weight. As I drifted off, I thought of Susan's face, her silence, and I felt no anger, only clarity. I'd shown her I wasn't alone, not in the way she'd meant. I was surrounded by the life I'd built, the people who valued me, the strength I'd found. And that was enough. The days following the confrontation at the Victorian unfolded with a serene stillness, like the hush of a forest after a storm has passed. Each morning, I woke in the familiar comfort of my old house, the one where Thomas's laughter still echoed in the walls, but my heart was increasingly tethered to the Victorian, where I'd begun to carve out a new chapter. Its rooms, bathed in the kaleidoscope of stained glass light and scented with the lavender I'd planted, stood as a monument to the life I was forging, one rooted in my own value independent of the approval I'd once sought. At 64, I had faced Susan's venom, Michael's apathy, and the weight of my own doubts emerging not merely intact, but fortified. Susan's cruel prophecy, "You'll die alone," had faded, its power dissolved by the truth I'd crafted. I was whole, and that was enough. No word came from Susan or Michael after they left the Victorian. A part of me had hoped for a gesture, a call, a note, even a hesitant acknowledgement of the boundary I'd drawn. But their silence was no surprise, and it no longer cut as it once would have. I had laid bare my truth, shown them the woman I'd become, and that act was its own kind of closure. My grandchildren Emma and Lucas remained a bright thread in my life, their voices bubbling through phone calls arranged by my daughter Lisa as they shared tales of school projects and playground adventures. I held those moments close like keepsakes in a velvet box, but I no longer waited for Michael or Susan to grant me a place in their world. I was shaping my own. The gathering I hosted for the community center volunteers was a celebration of that new world. Ruth and I transformed the Victorian's backyard into a haven, with tables draped in linen strings of fairy lights, twinkling in the dusk, and platters of my cinnamon rolls and cherry pies. The volunteers arrived, their chatter and warmth filling the house, blending with the fragrance of the roses I'd planted. I wore my green dress, the one Ruth said made my eyes shine, and Thomas's watch glinted on my wrist as I moved among my guests. I wasn't merely hosting. I was a woman at ease in her own life, surrounded by people who saw me not as a role to be filled, but as Dorothy, vibrant and present. Ruth raised a glass of iced tea, her voice ringing out with a toast to Dorothy's new beginning, and the applause that followed wrapped around me like a quilt, warm and grounding. I began splitting my time between the Victorian and my old house, a gradual shift that felt like learning to trust a new rhythm. The Victorian was becoming home its sunroom, a sanctuary where I sketched the roses, the volunteers, and memories of Emma and Lucas's smiles. I framed Thomas's letters and hung them in the foyer, their words a quiet hymn to the love that had anchored me. In the backyard, I tended the red rose bush. I'd planted its blooms, a vivid echo of my mother's garden, and a symbol of my own tenacity. Each time I knelt in the dirt, I felt a surge of gratitude, not for what I'd taken from Susan, but for what I'd reclaimed for myself. Lisa's calls grew more frequent, her tone softened by a curiosity that felt sincere. She didn't know the full scope of the house or the confrontation, but she sensed a change asking about my sketches, my volunteer work, the rosebush I'd described. Her invitations to Chicago became more insistent, and I agreed to visit in the fall, not to fill the void left by Michael and Susan, but to meet her as the woman I was now. Dorothy, who chose her connections with intention, who carried her own light. The plane ticket sat on my dresser, a promise of a journey I'd take on my terms. One quiet evening, as I sat in the Victorian sunroom with a mug of chamomile tea, I reflected on forgiveness. I didn't harbor hatred for Susan, though the memory of her words still carried a faint bruise. I didn't resent Michael, though his silence had wounded me more deeply than I could express. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about absolving them. It was about releasing myself from the burden of their choices. I'd stood in my truth, shown them my strength, and whether they embraced it was their load to bear, not mine. I was at peace not because they had changed, but because I had grown beyond their reach. My volunteer work expanded, reaching beyond the community center to a local shelter, where I taught baking classes to women rebuilding their lives. Their stories of lost betrayal and quiet triumphs mirrored my own, and in their resilience, I saw my own reflected back. I gave Thomas's watch to one of them, a woman named Elena, whose steady determination reminded me of the girl I'd been. "Wear it when you need to feel unbreakable," I told her, and her tearful embrace was a bridge between our journeys. The act of giving it away felt right, like passing a torch, and I knew Thomas would have smiled. As autumn approached, I stood in the Victorians' backyard, the rosebush ablaze with late blooms, despite the crisp air. I held a small candle lit in memory of Thomas, its flame unwavering in the gathering dusk. I thought of the path I'd walked from that rainy afternoon in Susan's kitchen, when her words had nearly shattered me, to this moment standing in a home I'd claimed with my own hands. I had been betrayed, dismissed, and overlooked, but I had risen not with vengeance, but with grace, with a love for myself that no one could take. I blew out the candle, the smoke rising like a prayer, and vowed to keep choosing that love day after day. I want to speak to you now, you who are watching you, who might feel unseen, cast aside by those you hold dear. Your value isn't defined by who welcomes you, who invites you to their table, or who claims you as their own. It's defined by how you choose to honor yourself, by the moments when you rise, when you build something new, when you plant your own seeds. You are not alone, not as long as you carry your own spark. And that spark, it's more powerful than you can imagine. I turned toward the house, its windows glowing softly in the twilight, and walked inside, the scent of roses clinging to my hands. I was home, not just in the Victorian, but in the life I'd crafted, in the woman I'd become. And that was the greatest triumph of all.